A volatile relationship ends with an act of desperation.
The first words out of her mouth was, I had no choice to defend myself.
She was scared that he might physically assault her, and that's why she had to use her gun.
She did not feel safe around him.
But the evidence isn't adding up.
She was saying that she was in fear for her life.
You're gonna threaten to arrest me for defending myself.
But he was not a fighter.
And when a suspect's social media reveals a disturbing past, investigators must determine if it's just entertainment or a window into the mind of a calculated killer.
She had a very prolific profile.
Some of them were just regular TikTok videos, and some were kind of disturbing.
I truly believe that she's evil.
Ten miles outside Des Moines, Iowa, lies the small town of Altoona. It's best known for its theme parks and racetrack. But on August 10th, 2022, the fun and games are disrupted by an emergency call.
Polk County 911, where was your emergency?
My boyfriend just tried attacking me, and I had no choice but to defend myself.
Okay, what's your name?
Marique Ruth. He is laying on the floor, and I'm pretty sure he's dead.
Okay, why do you think he's dead?
Because I shot him.
The person shot was John Killen, who was living in the home with her and her adult son.
She told the dispatcher that she wasn't going to go near him, and then that's when she was instructed to exit the house for the arriving officers.
When police get there, they find Marique and her 22-year-old son Cole waiting as instructed. Officers quickly enter the residence to check on the boyfriend.
John was face down in the living room. He appeared to be shot multiple times.
You could see a large amount of blood coming from what appeared to be his mouth behind his ear. So there were some visible wounds.
Right away, I could see a bullet hole in the side of his neck.
They tried to render aid and found that he was already deceased. He was declared dead at the scene.
Marique seemed shocked with the whole situation. Her hands were visibly shaking.
We've been fighting since I got home. I asked him to leave. He refused, and he came after me like he was gonna punch me. I grabbed my gun out of my purse.
Okay, then what happened?
I just pulled the trigger.
Her son says he had just left the room when the shots were fired.
Cole was walking down the stairs to his bedroom from the living room where John and Marique were arguing when he said that 3 or 4 shots occurred from behind him. He says he didn't see it.
The overall factor was that Marique had been on and off again with John. They argued a lot.
Marique stated that she was scared of John, that he might physically assault her, and that's why she had to use her gun in self-defense.
She clearly is stating that she shot him 3 times.
I thought he was gonna hurt me.
We want to try and really nail down who is Marique Ruth, who is John Killen, and what the circumstances are that led to this particular incident. So with that, we kind of peer into the past of both Marique and John.
John Killen was born in Des Moines, Iowa in 1981. He was the youngest of 3 boys raised by LaDonna and David Killen.
LaDonna took care of the home and kids, and John's father was a truck driver his whole life.
John didn't really have a childhood. John's dad was hard on John.
John adored his mother, But by the time he was in high school, their turbulent home life had become too much for her to take.
His mother said that she was going to go visit out in Montana, and the visit turned out to, I'm never coming back home. John was 16 and he still needed a lot of guidance.
In her absence, John tried to build a relationship with his father.
John didn't graduate high school. He'd rather go to work with his dad, working on semi-trucks. He wanted that, approval from his father. He wanted that so badly.
In his teen years, John began dating his childhood friend, Angela.
John and I met in middle school, so junior high school. We just hung out basically every day, so we just were just like, I guess we're just boyfriend and girlfriend now.
John decided the relationship was important enough to settle down. And in 2002, he and Angela got married. 3 years later, their son was born.
My mom kind of spoiled me a little bit. I was my dad's right-hand man a lot of the time, and it was very just like, he's just learning.
He was just always trying to be a better father than what he had as a child.
But despite John's efforts, he couldn't escape the patterns he learned at an early age.
When my parents got divorced, I was probably 5 or 6 years old.
The last straw for John and I's relationship was when we had a verbal argument in our home, and I see Joe, his head is buried in the couch with his hands over his ears because we were fighting, and I couldn't handle that.
Mentally, the divorce changed him. It made John, I feel, a lot more depressed, and he would drink more. John was scared to be alone. It was the abandonment from his father and his mother. Shortly after John's divorce was final, he had gotten on a dating site and met Cassie.
I would say with John and I's relationship, it was pretty fast. When we initially started dating, I knew that he drank some. I just didn't know how much. We got engaged shortly after we got together, probably about a year.
When John learned he was going to be a father again, he approached it as a second chance.
I always encouraged him to go to therapy. He was put on meds and things were going well. But when he wanted to drink, obviously the meds and beer would not get along. The whole time that John and I were together was kind of off and on as far as arguing, good times, great memories, bad moments.
John's struggles with alcohol continued, and by 2022, he and Cassie separated.
He had to have somebody there at all times just to feel like wanted. It wasn't even a month after we had split, he found Marique.
She was completely different than my uncle's previous relationships. She was cool, collected, kind of laid back, easy to interact with.
He was excited about it. He said that, she worked, had a good paying job. She had her own apartment, a son that lived with her that was around Joe's age.
I thought she was a chill person to be around. My dad seemed happy. Stuff was going well.
But 5 months after moving in with Marique, John's last chance at a happy family has ended in violence. And detectives are beginning their investigation into what happened.
I told the officers, hey, why don't you take Marique and Cole up to PD, and we'll be up there as soon as we can to interview them. After that, I did go inside the house, look at the crime scene real quick.
John's body is positioned on the floor beside a couch which divides the living room from the kitchen.
At the time, his legs was towards the couch. I noticed that there's shell casings on the floor and some were on the cushions of the couch.
We noticed right away that there was one shell casing in the kitchen area, and the other shell casings were on the other side of the couch in the living room area. So someone would have to advance over the top of the couch in order to fire those rounds.
Detectives must ask, why would someone claiming self-defense advance on their attacker?
How did the shell casing get to the opposite side of where the body's lying? That's kind of strange to me. She's claiming self-defense. Things are just not matching up right now. We need to lock this place down and get a search warrant.
Coming up, Marique tells investigators about John's history of violence.
She said John had been involved in another domestic incident with a prior girlfriend.
But his loved ones tell a different story.
I was never worried about my dad hurting someone. My dad never got physical.
Altoona police are in the early stages of investigating the death of John Killen. His girlfriend, Marique Ruth, claims she shot him in self-defense.
After looking at the crime scene, to me, it didn't quite convince me that it's self-defense yet, just due to the shell casings. There's more to the story that we don't know about.
While awaiting a search warrant, investigators gather a formal statement from Marique.
She seemed shaken, certainly initially, but she calmed down and she was very cooperative.
Marique said that her and John's relationship was relatively new. She said that they were always constantly arguing, that he was always drunk and always high.
Marique tells detectives John had never been physically abusive with her before, but he did have a history of violence.
She had informed me that John had been involved in another domestic incident with a prior girlfriend.
According to Marique, John had choked his ex-girlfriend Cassie, who got a court to issue a no-contact order. Marique says she had that in the back of her mind when she and John got into an argument earlier that evening.
Leading up to that day, there was an argument over money. Marique was upset by John's not holding up his agreement within their relationship to get a job and to stop drinking. Marique said they were arguing over a span of hours. John left for a short period of time to take his young daughter back to the mother's house.
Marique assumed John would use the time to cool off, but when he returned, the situation escalated.
She believed that he was drunk and high on cocaine.
Marique tells investigators that she went into the bedroom to avoid John, then realized she'd left her son in danger.
Marique told me that she could overhear essentially what she describes as this yelling match or a brawl of some type. So Marique told me that she grabbed her handgun out of the side portion of her bed, and then she took that handgun out to the living room area where John and Cole were seated, essentially in order to intimidate John.
She said Cole was tired of the arguing, so he left on his own to go downstairs.
She told John he needed to leave, and he said something to the effect of, "Bitch, I'm not leaving. You need to leave."
John had stood up and was going to come at her over the top of the couch. She told me that John swung at her. Because of that action, she fired a warning shot at him. Marica's claim was she was fearful that John was going to continue to come at her, so she fired 3 more times at John.
Marique says as soon as she realized what she'd done, she dropped the weapon and called 911. When investigators speak to Marica's son, his statement is consistent with hers.
Marique was saying that she was in fear for her life and that she was retreating. Well, that's fine, except that the shell casings are telling us another story. The only way that those shell casings can get on the other side of the couch is if Marique, instead of retreating in some fashion, she actually advanced on John.
After receiving the search warrant, detectives analyzed the scene more closely to confirm Marica's story. Though aspects of the scene are consistent with her version of events, other details stand out.
There was a handgun on the kitchen table, which we expected to see.
Marique said she fired down towards the floor or towards the couch, but the shell casings are not on the right-hand side. They're on the left-hand side of a person on the couch. That doesn't make sense. She had to be switched around, and she was in the living room, and John was in the kitchen.
Despite investigators' concerns, the attorney's office decides they do not have enough to pursue the case. But shortly after the interviews, John's loved ones call police, angry about the decision.
I talked to Joe Killen, which is John's son. Joe said, "What the heck's going on? John's not an aggressive person. This is not making sense."
My dad never got physical. I was never worried about my dad hurting someone, especially my mom and Cassie, during an argument. But I guess Marique found my dad texting Cassie, saying that he misses her. And I think Marique felt betrayed.
Police hope Cassie can corroborate or deny Joe's claims, so they contact her for an interview.
I felt that John and Marica's relationship was pretty toxic. But the way that I saw it when I was sitting there answering questions is, if I could get up and walk out the door, why couldn't she?
After learning jealousy might have been the cause of John Killen's death, police reach out to his ex-girlfriend, Cassie Swanberg. She says his recent text messages sounded like a desperate attempt to escape his crumbling relationship with Marique Ruth.
I did not have any intent of getting back with John. I am sure that Marique saw it a different way. All he kept saying to me was that she's crazy.
When investigators ask Cassie about Marica's claim that John choked her, she says it was a misunderstanding.
There was moments where we would get physical, but I never felt like he was going to hurt me. I never felt like my life was threatened.
She mentioned basically he'd put his arms around her neck or on her neck, but didn't strangle her. And it was a recount of something that happened many years prior.
When I ended things, I was encouraged by the police department to file a no contact order. That was the last thing that I wanted to do, but I needed my space.
They also interview John's ex-wife, Angela, who corroborates Cassie's depiction of John.
He gets temperamental. He had some jealousy issues, but it was all verbal arguing. It wasn't anything else.
He would never get physical with me. He was not a fighter.
So what Marique is saying doesn't quite match up.
Detectives return to the precinct to review the inconsistencies. While they're talking, an officer from another department overhears their discussion.
It led me to remember an incident that took place approximately 2 months before that, in which Marique had made statements to me about shooting John.
That was a bombshell. We had no idea, and so immediately we bring up the body cam footage.
On June 4th of 2022 at approximately 8:11 p.m., I was called to assist Officer Dokes at the Casey's general store in the parking lot. Marique had called 911, essentially claiming a domestic situation and wanting John removed from the house. She stated that John was highly intoxicated.
At the time, Marique said she and John had been arguing, but there was no assault or physical altercation.
She had asked John to leave. The problem with that was, from a legal standpoint, is that he's on the lease. Despite the issues with alcoholism, it's not illegal to be drunk in your house.
As I was standing there with Marique, John's niece, Haley Killen, arrived on scene.
Would you like me to go talk to John? I'll go talk to John. You go talk to John and he's gonna end up hitting you.
She was talking about how he would just show up and cause a scene, pretty much. And I had told her that if he does that, to just call the cops. And she had kept making excuses as to why it wouldn't matter.
Okay, if you busted in, call the cops again and make sure that they did something busted in, like shooting. I thought it was.
I kind of lost it on her at that point.
You know, it's not very smart to be talking about
So
in general.
he can
No,
say that-
but when you're sitting here making premeditated statements, it's not smart. And that's exactly what that is. So you know what happens in the event that that happens? This audio recording, video recording of this is going to play against you. And it's not going to go in your favor.
You're going to threaten to arrest me for defending myself.
The footage, taken just 2 months before John's death, casts serious doubt on Marique's claims of self-defense.
It always makes your spidey senses tingle a little bit, because if somebody's talking about that ahead of time, they've got a preconceived notion of, as long as they just say that they're in fear for their lives, they can get away with murder.
Rather than confront Marique and tip her off to their concerns, detectives pay a visit to John's niece, Haley Killen.
On the afternoon of August 11th, Officer Friedrich from the Altoona Police Department showed up to my house.
What came out of that interview was that John was very mouthy, that he drinks. However, he has never been physical with Marique.
Marique had never, to me, stated that she was scared of John or that she was in fear of her life.
Haley admits her uncle was flawed, but says if anyone in the relationship was violent, it was Marique.
She had always let it be known that she did have a permit to carry and that it was there to protect her if need be. When Marique made those comments, me and my uncle kind of brushed it off as like it was a joke. We didn't really take it seriously.
She claims Marique had even made thinly veiled threats against Cassie.
April of 22, Marique was on the phone company trying to put John's number on her phone account to take off from Cassie's. They were kind of arguing back and forth, and she made comments about how she can commit murder and make it look like a suicide.
Coming up, Marique's online videos reveal a shocking new piece of evidence.
In this video, Let's start off with headstone.
And detectives pit mother against son to see who will come clean.
When we talked to Cole, that changed everything.
Allegations of Marique Ruth's threats against John Killen and his ex-girlfriend prompt detectives to take a closer look at her life through social media.
Haley was the one that brought the TikToks to life. She gave me Marica's TikTok name on her account.
Some of them were just regular TikTok videos, and some were kind of disturbing.
There was one that had a picture of a kind of a snarling wolf saying, "Don't push me or I'll do things that you never thought I would do."
One video in particular catches investigators' eyes.
In this video, it looked like she might have been proposed to or engaged because she does have a ring on her finger. But it started off with a headstone.
We learned that she was married to somebody much younger than her.
There was a shooting in that incident too. And she claimed that this husband committed suicide.
She openly talked about it. My husband shot himself in front of me.
But this had never been brought up by Marique through hours of interviews. And so to me, that seemed like something somebody would bring up.
For us as investigators, it changed the dynamic of how we would approach this case, because now we have another significant other that's dead. And so we had to investigate the circumstances surrounding her former spouse's death.
Through a records request, police discover that Marica's former husband, Dustin Ruth, died 2 years earlier on October 4th, 2020, in Chickasaw County, Iowa.
We went to Chickasaw County, we got the report, we got the photos, and we really dug into it.
Dustin James Ruth was his full name at birth. He was born August 23rd of 1997. Even from a very tiny age, you could tell that his heart was full of love for anybody and everybody. But there was some abuse as a child.
Emotional scars from abuse affected all aspects of Dustin's life.
He had depression very bad. He was bipolar. He liked to have somebody there with him. It's like he was almost afraid to be alone by himself.
When Dustin was 19, he met 37-year-old Marique Ruth through mutual friends.
They had phone conversations. I was pretty shocked and surprised, especially after I learned about the big age difference between the two of them.
2 years later, in December 2018, they got married and moved in together along with Marica's son. Not long after their marriage, Dustin's family noticed signs of trouble.
When I would get a call from him, she was always on the phone. She thrived on that control that she had over Dustin. He told me she accused him of cheating on her all the time. It was always a threat of, "I'll beat your ass."
Just before the couple's second anniversary, Dustin's mother got the terrible news from Marica's son.
It was Sunday, October 4th of 2020. My husband and I were in church, and I had over 30 missed calls. I called Cole back, and he answered, and I said, "Cole, what's wrong?" And he said, "Dustin is dead."
Marique claimed Dustin shot himself during an argument in their bedroom.
She said that Dustin grabbed her handgun. He just turned around, looked at her, and shot himself.
The investigation did not yield enough evidence to prove otherwise, and Marique was never charged in relation to Dustin's death.
Our local sheriff's department declared that Dustin had committed suicide. Marique moved to Urbandale, Iowa, the first weekend in December of the same year with another man. I have my suspicions, but I can't prove them.
To detectives investigating John Killen's death, the similarities are uncanny.
John and her former spouse were younger than her, and they both died by gunshot wounds. And Marique was essentially present for both of those deaths. It really made us bear down as to the facts and circumstances, especially for John Killen's case, of exactly what Marique was telling us.
Uncovering another dead husband has strengthened police suspicions that Marique Ruth murdered John Killen.
John Killen's autopsy showed that he was shot 4 times.
2 of the bullets went into his wrist, down his arm, and out his bicep or tricep area. There's another shot that went into his belly, and another one that went into his neck.
Marique is describing how John came after her and how she fired a warning shot, which didn't work, and then 3 shots to his chest to defend herself. So this couldn't be self-defense when she shot him 4 times.
It appeared that every time she shot, it did hit John.
I found that the round that broke his wrist to be significant in the circumstances that he's probably got his hands up trying to protect himself from being shot.
Though it's possible that the wound was caused while John was trying to punch Marique, the bullet positioning makes her claims seem unlikely.
He was basically trying to defend himself after she shot him the first time. "What are you doing? I can't believe you shot me," and was backing away from her as she continued to shoot.
The other really significant thing that I saw on the autopsy report was the toxicology. Marique was saying that John was really, really drunk and belligerent and was going to attack her. She also, at the tail end, has this kicker of he's also been doing cocaine.
The toxicology revealed that John had been drinking, but not that much. It was barely over the legal limit. There certainly was no stimulants in his system, as she had indicated.
Instead of confronting Marique with the inconsistencies and giving her the chance to fabricate a new story, detectives ask her to walk them through the shooting again, this time with cameras rolling.
I'm just simply trying to get to the truth. So knocking on that door and then requesting to do a walkthrough with her, basically out of the blue, essentially, she complied with that, which really surprised me.
Sometimes when people are walking through a scene and describing things, you get little hints, or sometimes they make motions with their hands or pantomime something or reveal accidentally.
So John was sitting here, and I said, "John, you need to leave."
You guys are at this distance?
We're at this distance. My gun was like this.
During the initial walkthrough, Marique's version of events aligns with her original statement.
At this point in time, I asked Marique, can you stop playing yourself and now be John? She kind of came over the top of the couch and swiped, but the way that she swiped at me, with me pretending to be her, was more or less at my stomach area, basically where one would typically be holding a gun. During her initial interview with me, Marique told me that John swung at her or tried to punch her in some fashion.
It didn't seem like John was trying to attack, but maybe more just defend himself against a weapon that's been brought out. So we were seeing that in real time.
Do you think he was trying to grab for the gun?
He either was grabbing for the gun or grabbing for me.
To detectives, it seems clear John was simply trying to escape.
At the edge of that couch is the top of the stairway, where that's the only way to get out of the house, unless if John jumps out the patio, which is 2 stories high.
He was being held at gunpoint. It would not be unreasonable for him to try to knock the gun aside or to try to get away from that threat.
After the walkthrough, Marique and her son are brought in for follow-up interviews. Investigators place them in separate rooms, hoping the pressure will cause one of them to crack.
When we talked to Cole, that changed everything.
I asked Cole, okay, so was there going to be this fight? Was there going to be this argument? Did you guys raise your voices at each other? And Cole said no. That actually John was trying to apologize to him for the way he was acting. And that was a huge red flag for me, because it completely contradicted what Marique had said.
In the other room, detectives ask Marique to comment on what her son has just revealed. Marique fails to contradict his statement.
She seemed to really start folding in on herself. Her body language changed, and it was very apparent she did not have a good excuse. He had asked, why didn't you leave? You know, there was no reason to stay. If you wanted him to leave, you could have left just the same. You had a phone, you could have called the police.
Marique eventually made the statement of, well, I had 2 choices. I had my gun and I had my cell phone, and I chose the gun.
This is not a self-defense case. It is a homicide.
After reviewing the evidence with the district attorney, investigators secure an arrest warrant for Marique Ruth and bring her in on March 15th, 2023.
She was appointed an attorney, and she declined to continue to talk to us.
During pretrial hearings, Marique's lawyer asks to exclude her previous husband's death on the grounds that it might prejudice the jury.
They didn't want to make her look like a black widow, I guess.
The judge agrees, ruling any mention of Dustin Ruth inadmissible. Despite the setback, the prosecution remains confident.
That's no issues really at all from us, because we're concentrated on John Killen.
On May 13th, 2024, Marique's trial begins.
I was called to the witness stand as the lead detective, and I walked the court and the jurors through the facts and circumstances of this case.
He was showing his interview video where she's just giving up information on her past history.
Just by more or less accident, she mentions her ex-husband during that video, and the defense attorney objected.
The judge immediately declares a mistrial, deciding that Marique would be retried with a new jury. 6 months later, on October 30th, 2024, the second trial begins. This time, prosecutors focus on the reason why Marique chose to shoot John Killen.
The motive for this case is born out of anger.
I got the feeling that Marique was afraid of losing John. And John talking about Cassie all the time probably really dug into her jealousy issues.
Marique claims she acted in self-defense, but the state argues nothing could be further from the truth. They say Marique decided that if she couldn't have John, no one could.
She decided to shoot him, and I think she had a thought that all I have to say is, I'm afraid for my life, and she would get away with it.
After a 5-day trial, the jury retires to deliberate.
They took about 2 hours and came back with guilty of first-degree murder.
When you're convicted of murder in the first degree, the mandatory sentence in Iowa is life without parole.
She's where she belongs. She just is. I truly believe that she's evil.
John didn't deserve to die. He had demons, but overall, his caring and his goofiness and, his love that he had for people over-trumped those demons.
My dad will be remembered for the kind-hearted man that he was from the moment he woke up to when he went to bed.
Cassie and I are doing the best we can with our kids. We have a great little family. I just wish that he was still here to be a part of it.
I love him so much. I was a daddy's girl. There's this bear that Mom put his voice inside of it. I squeeze it, and then he would say, "Tell Sissy I love her." I'm gonna have it forever.
The human psyche is a complex landscape, particularly when relationships enter a volatile phase, where control, jealousy, and fear begin to intertwine. In many tragic instances, what is presented as a sudden, desperate act of self-preservation is, upon closer inspection, the culmination of a deeply calculated narrative designed to exploit the very legal systems meant to protect the vulnerable. The case of Marique Ruth and John Killen offers a profound study in the contrast between subjective, self-serving claims of self-defense and the objective, unyielding truth of physical forensics. It raises vital questions about why such domestic tragedies continue to occur with alarming frequency. The subtle psychological warning signs that are so often overlooked by loved ones, and the precise, analytical methods that law enforcement must employ to dismantle a suspect's carefully constructed illusions. To understand why volatile relationships so frequently escalate to the point of irreversible tragedy, one must look at the underlying dynamics of control and codependency. Often, individuals who struggle with deep-seated insecurities, childhood trauma, or substance dependency find themselves drawn to partners who present a calm, reassuring exterior, only to later discover a rigid desire for dominance beneath that facade. When a relationship begins to fracture, the controlling partner may perceive the other's attempt to pull away not merely as a rejection, but as an existential threat to their authority. Rather than seeking mediation, counseling, or a peaceful separation, they may begin to formulate a narrative of victimization. In these scenarios, the claim of self-defense is not a spontaneous reaction to an imminent physical threat, but a premeditated legal shield. The individual operates under the assumption that if they can successfully portray themselves as terrified and cornered, the law will excuse any measure of force they choose to deploy. This calculated misuse of the legal concept of self-preservation is a recurring theme in domestic homicides, prompting investigators to look far beyond the initial statements made in the immediate aftermath of a crisis. The quiet community of Altoona, situated approximately 10 miles outside the bustling city of Des Moines, Iowa, is typically known for its family-friendly attractions, amusement parks, and lively racetrack. However, on the evening of August 10, 2022, the peaceful atmosphere of this small town was shattered by an urgent call to the local emergency 911 dispatch center. The caller was Marique Ruth, who reported that a shooting had occurred inside her home, where she resided avec her adult son and her partner, John Killen. On the recorded line, Marique informed the dispatcher that she had been forced to defend herself against an imminent physical assault and was instructing her 22-year-old son, Cole, to wait outside the residence as directed by the emergency operator. When the responding officers arrived at the scene, they observed Marique and Cole waiting near the exterior of the home, both appearing visibly shaken. Marique's hands were trembling, and she immediately began repeating a narrative that would become the cornerstone of her defense. She had been terrified for her life. She had no choice, and she had only fired her weapon to stop an attack. Upon entering the residence, officers proceeded quickly to the living area to assess the situation and render any possible aid to the victim. There, they discovered John Killen lying face down on the living room floor near a couch. It was immediately apparent that he had sustained multiple serious injuries. Despite the swift response of the emergency personnel, John exhibited no signs of life, and he was pronounced deceased at the scene. The physical layout of the room and the initial appearance of the body immediately presented several questions to the arriving detectives. While Marique continued to assert that she had been cornered and forced to fire her weapon to prevent John from physically assaulting her, the experienced investigators noted that the visual evidence in the room did not immediately align with a standard scenario of a close-quarters physical struggle. The air was heavy with the scent of spent gunpowder, and the silence of the home stood in stark contrast to the chaotic sequence of events described by the surviving resident. As the detective division began to process the scene, they focused their attention on the physical remnants of the confrontation, most notably the spent shell casings scattered across the floor. In any investigation involving a firearm, the location of spent casings provides a critical mathematical map of where the shooter was standing at the moment the weapon was discharged. Investigators noted that while John's body was positioned on the living room floor near the couch, the shell casings were not clustered in a single area, nor were they positioned where one would expect if a person had fired while retreating or standing their ground in a defensive posture. Instead, detectives discovered one shell casing in the kitchen area, while the remaining casings were found on the opposite side of the couch, deep within the living room area. This physical distribution suggested a dynamic sequence of movement. For the casings to land in these distinct, separated locations, the shooter would have had to advance over or around the couch, pursuing the target rather than backing away. This initial observation introduced a significant discrepancy. If Marique was indeed retreating in fear for her life, the physical evidence should have shown a defensive stance. Instead, the ballistics suggested an active advancement. While the technical team worked to secure a search warrant to thoroughly document the residence, detectives conducted preliminary interviews to piece together the histories of the individuals involved. John Killen was born in Des Moines, Iowa, in the year 1981, the youngest of 3 sons born to LaDonna and David Killen. His upbringing was marked by instability and a lack of emotional support, as his father maintained a demanding schedule as a truck driver, and his mother eventually departed the family home when John was only 16 years old. Seeking approval and guidance in the absence of a stable domestic environment, John chose to forego completing his high school education to join his father in working on semi-trucks. Throughout his life, John carried the emotional scars of early abandonment, which fostered a deep-seated fear of being alone and a persistent desire to find a lasting, loving partnership. In his younger years, John married his childhood friend, Angela, in the year 2002, and the couple welcomed a son 3 years later. John made sincere efforts to be a supportive, present father, consciously striving to provide the emotional warmth he had lacked during his own childhood. However, the communication patterns and emotional volatility he had witnessed in his youth proved difficult to escape. When the marriage eventually dissolved, the separation took a significant toll on John's mental well-being, exacerbating a tendency toward depression and an increased reliance on alcohol as a coping mechanism. Following his divorce, John entered a subsequent relationship with Cassie, which was characterized by a rapid progression, periods of mutual support, and recurring verbal arguments fueled by alcohol. Despite attempting therapy and medication, the combination of personal struggles and relationship friction led to their eventual separation in the year 2022. It was shortly after this separation, in the spring of 2022, that John met Marique Ruth. To John's family and friends, Marique initially appeared to be a stabilizing force. She was described as calm, collected, and independent, possessing a stable job, her own apartment, and an adult son who was close in age to John's own son. John expressed immense optimism about this new chapter, believing he had finally found a peaceful partnership. However, within 5 months of moving into her residence, this hope ended in his tragic death, leaving detectives with the task of determining whether the shooting was a genuine act of self-defense or a calculated act of violence. During her formal interview at the police station, Marique, cooperative and detailed in her description of the events leading up to the shooting. She explained that her relationship with John had become increasingly toxic, marked by constant arguments regarding financial matters, his lack of employment, and his substance use. According to Marique, John had spent the hours preceding the incident consuming alcohol and was allegedly under the influence of illicit substances. She claimed that when the verbal dispute escalated, she retreated to her bedroom to avoid him. However, upon hearing what she described as a loud verbal confrontation between John and her son, Cole, in the living area, she felt compelled to intervene. Marique stated that she retrieved her handgun from her bedside table with the intention of intimidating John and de-escalating the situation. According to her narrative, Cole chose to leave the room and head downstairs to his bedroom to escape the ongoing tension. Marique claimed that she then ordered John to leave the apartment, to which he responded with verbal hostility. She asserted that John then rose from his seat and attempted to lunge at her over the back of the couch, prompting her to fire an initial warning shot toward the floor. When he allegedly continued to advance, she stated that she fired 3 additional times in rapid succession, believing her physical safety was in immediate jeopardy. Her son's initial statement appeared to support this sequence of events, as he confirmed hearing a verbal dispute followed by several rapid gunshots after he had walked downstairs. Despite the apparent consistency between the mother and son's initial statements, investigators remained skeptical of the self-defense claim due to the physical realities of the crime scene. The placement of the shell casings strongly indicated that the shooter had not been standing in a defensive, stationary position near the kitchen or the hallway. Rather, the evidence suggested that the person pulling the trigger had moved aggressively across the living space, advancing toward the couch where John was located. To gain clarity, detectives sought to corroborate Marique's claims regarding John's history of domestic volatility. Marique had informed officers that John had a history of physical violence, specifically claiming that he had choked his former partner, Cassie, leading to a legal no-contact order. When detectives contacted Cassie to verify these assertions, they received a vastly different perspective. Cassie clarified that while their past relationship had been tumultuous, and she had been advised to seek a protective order to establish personal space, John had never engaged in severe physical violence or attempted to strangle her. She emphasized that she had never felt that her life was threatened by him. Similarly, John's first wife, Angela, and his adult son, Joe, strongly rejected the characterization of John as a physical aggressor. They described him as a non-confrontational individual who, despite his struggles with alcohol, was not prone to physical violence. Furthermore, Joe revealed a critical piece of information. John had recently been communicating with Cassie, expressing a desire to end his relationship with Marique and move on. This revelation introduced a powerful alternative motive: jealousy and the resentment of being rejected. The investigation took a dramatic and unexpected turn when an officer from a neighboring department overheard detectives discussing the details of the case. The officer recalled a prior incident involving Marique and John that had occurred approximately 2 months earlier, on June 4, 2022, at a local convenience store parking lot. Detectives immediately retrieved the body camera footage from that evening to review the interaction. The footage captured a highly telling exchange. Marique had contacted emergency services, requesting that officers remove John from her home because he was intoxicated. When officers explained that they could not legally force John to leave because he was a legal resident listed on the lease, Marique became visibly frustrated. During the recorded interaction, in the presence of John's niece, Haley, Marique made explicit statements regarding her willingness to use her firearm against John if he continued to cause disruptions. The responding officer on the footage was seen delivering a stern, prophetic warning to Marique, advising her that making premeditated remarks about using deadly force was highly dangerous. The officer cautioned her that if she ever did carry out such an action, the audio and video recordings of her current statements would be used as evidence against her in a court of law, undermining any future claim of self-defense.
Marique's
defensive response on the recording, accusing the officer of threatening to arrest her for defending herself, demonstrated a pre-existing mindset that she could utilize her status as a permit holder to justify violence under the guise of protection. Equipped with this critical piece of behavioral evidence, detectives expanded their search into Marique's digital footprint. Haley Killen, John's niece, provided investigators with access to Marique's social media profiles, specifically her TikTok account. The content of these videos painted a disturbing picture that contrasted sharply with the image of a frightened, passive victim. Alongside mundane everyday clips, Marique had posted videos featuring dark, symbolic imagery, including warnings about the consequences of crossing her, accompanied by aggressive text and music. One video particularly drew the attention of the investigative team. It began with an image of a headstone and transitioned to Marique displaying an engagement ring. Through further research, detectives uncovered a shocking historical detail that Marique had completely omitted during her extensive interviews. Her previous husband, Dustin Ruth, had also died of a gunshot wound. Detectives immediately contacted authorities in Chickasaw County, Iowa, to obtain the records surrounding the death of Dustin James Ruth, which had occurred on October 4, 2020. Dustin, who was born on August 23, 1997, was significantly younger than Marique, having met her when he was 19 and she was 37. Family members described Dustin as a kind-hearted but vulnerable young man who struggled with severe depression and bipolar disorder. Following their marriage in December 2018, Dustin's family observed a highly controlling dynamic, with Marique dominating his schedule, monitoring his communications, and allegedly issuing threats of physical confrontation. On the afternoon of October 4, 2020, Dustin's mother received a call from Marique's son Cole, informing her that Dustin was deceased. Marique claimed that during a verbal argument in their bedroom, Dustin had suddenly grabbed her handgun and taken his own life. At the time, the local sheriff's department did not find sufficient physical evidence to dispute her account, and the death was officially ruled a suicide. Within months of Dustin's passing, Marique relocated to another county with a new partner. For the detectives investigating the death of John Killen, the parallels between the two cases were impossible to ignore. Both victims were younger men who struggled with vulnerability. Both had entered domestic partnerships with Marique that quickly became toxic, and both had died from gunshot wounds inflicted by Marique's personal firearm in her immediate presence. With this profound contextual understanding, the investigative team examined the forensic findings from John Killen's autopsy. The medical examiner's report provided definitive proof that dismantled Marique's narrative of self-defense. John had been struck by 4 distinct rounds. 2 of the entry wounds were located on his wrist and forearm, indicating a classic defensive posture, as if he had raised his hands in front of his face and chest to shield himself from an oncoming threat. Another round had entered his neck, and another had struck his torso. Furthermore, the toxicology analysis refuted Marique's claim that John was highly intoxicated and under the influence of cocaine at the time of his death. His blood alcohol concentration was only slightly above the legal limit for operating a motor vehicle, and there were absolutely no stimulants or illicit substances present in his system. This scientific evidence strongly suggested that John was not acting as a crazed, aggressive assailant, but was instead attempting to shield himself and back away from an active shooter. Rather than immediately confronting Marique with these findings, the lead detective employed a highly effective investigative tactic. He requested that Marique participate in a voluntary, video-recorded walkthrough of the crime scene at her residence to physically demonstrate how the confrontation had occurred. Marique agreed, confident that she could reinforce her narrative. During the walkthrough, the detective asked Marique to switch roles and portray John, demonstrating his physical actions, while the detective stood in her position. As Marique attempted to mimic John's supposed aggression, her physical gestures betrayed her words. Instead of demonstrating a powerful, offensive punch over the couch, she performed a defensive swiping motion downward toward the detective's midsection, precisely where a firearm would be held. This physical demonstration in real time indicated that John's final actions were likely a desperate attempt to swat the weapon away or protect himself, rather than an unprovoked physical assault. The final piece of the investigative puzzle fell into place during the subsequent separate interviews of Marique and her son, Cole. Under focused questioning regarding the alleged brawl that had supposedly drawn Marique from her bedroom with her firearm, Cole chose to speak honestly. He revealed to detectives that there had been no physical fight or aggressive yelling match between himself and John prior to the shooting. In fact, Cole stated that John had actually been speaking quietly, offering a sincere apology for his behavior earlier in the evening. This revelation completely contradicted Marique's claim of an imminent domestic emergency that justified retrieving a deadly weapon. When detectives presented Marique with her son's statement and questioned her as to why she did not simply leave the residence or call the authorities if she felt unsafe, her composure fractured. She uttered a highly telling admission, stating that she had been faced with two choices: her phone or her gun, and she had chosen the gun. This statement solidified the prosecution's case, transforming the incident from a plausible claim of self-defense into a clear-cut case of first-degree murder. On March 15, 2023, law enforcement officers executed an arrest warrant for Marique Ruth, charging her with first-degree murder. As the case proceeded toward trial, the defense successfully petitioned the court to exclude any mention of Dustin Ruth's death, arguing that introducing the details of her former husband's passing would unfairly prejudice the jury. The judge ruled this historical information inadmissible, requiring the prosecution to secure a conviction solely on the merits of the evidence surrounding John Killen's death. The first trial commenced on May 13, 2024. However, during the testimony of the lead detective, a portion of an interview recording was played in which Marique briefly referenced her deceased former husband. The defense immediately objected, and the judge declared a mistrial to preserve the fairness of the proceedings. 6 months later, on October 30, 2024, the second trial began with a newly selected jury. The prosecution presented a meticulous, evidence-based case, focusing heavily on the scientific trajectory of the gunshots, the defensive wounds on John's wrist, the telltale placement of the shell casings, and the critical body camera footage from the previous June where Marique had openly discussed using her firearm. The state argued passionately that the motive was not fear, but a toxic combination of anger, jealousy, and a desire for control sparked by the realization that John intended to leave her and return to his former partner. After a 5-day trial, the jury retired to deliberate, returning in just under 2 hours with a unanimous verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Under Iowa law, this conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Marique Ruth would remain incarcerated for the remainder of her natural life. This tragic case offers profound, universal life lessons regarding the prevention of domestic escalation and the vital importance of recognizing psychological red flags in personal relationships. One of the most critical lessons is the danger of ignoring patterns of controlling behavior, isolation, and verbal threats. In both of Marique's documented relationships, She exhibited a strong desire to dominate her partners, utilizing their personal vulnerabilities, such as Dustin's mental health struggles and John's battle with alcohol, to establish an unequal power dynamic. Family members and friends must remain vigilant when a loved one begins to isolate themselves, expresses anxiety about displeasing a partner, or laughs off thinly veiled threats of violence as mere jokes. In domestic environments, threats of violence, even when delivered in a seemingly lighthearted manner or during a verbal dispute, must always be taken seriously and addressed through appropriate safety planning and professional intervention. Furthermore, this case highlights the critical importance of robust communication and information sharing within the law enforcement community. The breakthrough in the investigation was made possible because an officer from another department took the initiative to share his recollection of a prior interaction, which led to the discovery of the highly damaging body camera footage. To catch perpetrators faster and prevent future tragedies, law enforcement agencies must continue to invest in integrated, easily searchable databases that log not only formal arrests, but also domestic disturbance calls, verbal warnings, and field interviews across different jurisdictions. If the responding officers in 2022 had possessed immediate real-time access to the detailed records of Dustin Ruth's suspicious death in 2020, the initial response and assessment of the scene on August 10th might have been expedited even further by prioritizing comprehensive background checks, preserving digital footprints, and utilizing sophisticated behavioral analysis during interviews. Justice systems can more effectively see through the false narratives of calculated offenders, honoring the memory of the victims and providing closure to the families left behind. Human relationships are complex and sometimes incredibly fragile. When a relationship is built on a foundation of volatility, insecurity, and control, it can spiral into a profound tragedy. On a warm summer evening in the state of Iowa, one such relationship reached a sudden and permanent conclusion, leaving behind a trail of grief, unanswered questions, and a legal puzzle that would test the dedication of local law enforcement. This is the story of a life cut short, a claim of self-defense that fell apart under the weight of scientific evidence, and the meticulous work of investigators who refused to let a calculated act of violence go unpunished. Altoona, Iowa, is a quiet community located about 10 miles outside the capital city of Des Moines. Known for its family-friendly theme parks and its lively racetrack, it is generally a place where residents feel secure and the pace of life is peaceful. However, on the evening of August 10th, 2022, the tranquility of this small town was shattered by a frantic call to the 911 emergency dispatcher. The voice on the line belonged to Marique Ruth, who reported that a shooting had occurred inside her home. She explained that she had been forced to protect herself from her boyfriend, a man named John Killen, who had been living in the residence alongside her and her 22-year-old son, Cole. When local police officers arrived at the suburban home, they found Marique Ruth and her son waiting outside as they had been instructed by the dispatcher. Marique appeared to be in a state of severe shock, with her hands visibly trembling as she spoke to the responding officers. Inside the house, the scene was far more somber. Officers entered the living room to find John Killen lying face down on the carpet beside a large living room couch. He was entirely unresponsive, and despite the immediate efforts of emergency responders to administer first aid, he was declared deceased at the scene. He had sustained multiple injuries, including a clear wound to the side of his neck, behind his ear, and near his mouth, with a significant amount of blood pooling around him. From the very beginning, Marique Ruth sought to establish a narrative of self-defense. She told the investigators that she and John had been engaged in a long and bitter argument that had escalated throughout the day. She claimed that when she arrived home, she demanded that he pack his belongings and leave the apartment. But he refused to comply. According to her statement, John then advanced toward her in an aggressive manner, looking as though he was going to physically assault her or strike her with his fists. Fearing for her safety and her life, she reached into her purse, retrieved a handgun, and pulled the trigger. She stated that she had fired a warning shot initially, followed by 3 more shots in rapid succession to halt his advance. Her son, Cole, initially supported this sequence of events, stating that he was walking down the stairs to his basement bedroom when the gunfire erupted, and did not witness the actual moments of the shooting, but heard several shots fired from the living room. But investigators quickly noticed that the physical evidence at the scene did not align with the story being presented. As detectives processed the living room, they paid close attention to the location of the discarded shell casings. A semi-automatic firearm ejects spent casings in a predictable pattern based on the position of the shooter. In this home, a large couch divided the living room from the kitchen area. While John Killen was found on one side of this couch, the investigators discovered that one shell casing was located in the kitchen area, while the remaining casings were found on the opposite side of the couch, resting on the cushions and the floor. This spatial distribution suggested that the shooter was not standing in a defensive, stationary position while retreating. Instead, the evidence strongly indicated that the shooter had actually advanced over or around the couch toward the victim while discharging the weapon. If Marique had truly been retreating in fear, the physical dynamics of the casings would have been entirely different. This discrepancy immediately raised red flags for the lead detectives, who realized that they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple case of self-defense. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, investigators began to look deeply into the personal histories of both John Killen and Marique Ruth. John was born in Des Moines in the year 1981, the youngest of 3 brothers. His childhood was marked by instability and hardship. His father was a hard-working truck driver who maintained a strict and sometimes harsh environment at home. John deeply admired his mother, but the strain of their turbulent family life eventually became too much for her to bear. When John was 16 years old, his mother left the family home to visit relatives in Montana and made the sudden decision never to return. This sudden departure left John without maternal guidance at a critical stage of his youth. Desperate for his father's approval, John chose to leave high school early to work alongside his father, repairing and maintaining large commercial trucks. In his late teenage years, John began a relationship with his childhood friend, Angela. The two had met in junior high school and were nearly inseparable. In the year 2002, they married and eventually welcomed a son named Joe. John tried his absolute best to be a loving and attentive father, determined to provide his son with the emotional support that he himself had lacked during his own upbringing. However, the deep emotional scars of his youth, combined with the stress of adult life, began to take a toll. After several years of marriage, an intense verbal argument in front of their young son became the final straw for Angela, who realized that the domestic environment was becoming unhealthy for their child. The subsequent divorce deeply affected John, exacerbating his struggles with depression and leading him to rely increasingly on alcohol as a coping mechanism. John had a profound fear of being alone, a psychological consequence of the abandonment he experienced as a teenager. Shortly after his divorce was finalized, he turned to online dating and met Cassie. Their relationship progressed rapidly, and within a year, they were engaged. When John learned that he was going to be a father again, he viewed it as a precious second chance to build a stable family. He made genuine efforts to seek therapy and was prescribed medication, which initially brought positive changes to his life. However, his struggle kept, hot alcohol persisted, and because the consumption of alcohol does not mix well with psychiatric medications, his behavior remained highly unpredictable. Periods of peace were frequently interrupted by intense arguments, and by early 2022, Cassie made the difficult decision to separate from him. Once again, unable to cope with the prospect of being alone, John sought companionship on a dating website. Within less than a month of his separation from Cassie, he met Marique Ruth. To John's family, Marique initially appeared to be a positive influence. She was calm, collected, and possessed a stable, well-paying job, her own apartment, and a son close in age to John's own son. John was incredibly excited about this new chapter, believing that he had finally found a peaceful and supportive partner. However, behind this calm exterior lay a far more controlling and volatile personality, and within 5 months of moving in together, the relationship would end in his tragic death. During her initial formal interviews with the police department, Marique portrayed herself as a victim who had been living in constant fear of John. She claimed that he was frequently intoxicated and under the influence of illegal substances, specifically cocaine. She also informed detectives that John had a history of physical violence, pointing to a past domestic incident with his former fiancée, Cassie, which had resulted in a court-ordered no-contact order. Marique asserted that this knowledge was fresh in her mind during their argument on August 10th, making her believe that her life was in imminent danger. To verify these claims, detectives reached out to those who knew John best, including his son Joe, his ex-wife Angela, and his former partner Cassie. The portrait they painted of John was vastly different from the aggressive, violent attacker Marique had described. Joe expressed profound confusion and anger over the decision not to immediately arrest Marique, insisting that his father was not a physical fighter and had never been physically violent during disputes. Angela confirmed that throughout their marriage, John had never once laid a hand on her. Cassie clarified that while their relationship had been turbulent and they had experienced verbal shouting matches, she had never felt that her life was threatened or that John was capable of severe physical harm. She explained that the previous domestic incident mentioned by Marique was a minor, non-violent misunderstanding from years prior, and that the no-contact order had been recommended by law enforcement simply as a routine measure to help them maintain their physical distance during a difficult breakup. As investigators continued to gather information, a breakthrough occurred from an unexpected source. An officer from a neighboring police department overheard the detectives discussing the case and recalled a highly significant incident that had occurred 2 months prior to the shooting. On June 4, 2022, Marique had called emergency services from the parking lot of a local convenience store, demanding that officers remove John from her apartment because he was highly intoxicated. When officers arrived, they explained to Marique that because John was legally listed on the lease, they could not force him to leave the residence simply for being drunk in his own home. The body camera footage from that June evening captured a chilling exchange. As John's niece arrived at the scene to help mediate, Marique became increasingly frustrated with the legal limitations explained by the police. She began discussing what would happen if she took matters into her own hands and used her firearm to protect herself. The responding officer, recognizing the dangerous path her thoughts were taking, issued a stern and prophetic warning. The officer told her that making premeditated statements about using a weapon would play heavily against her in a court of law and would not look favorable. Marique responded defensively, asking if they were threatening to arrest her for defending herself. This recorded conversation was a massive piece of evidence for the detectives. It proved that at least 2 months before the fatal shooting, Marique was already thinking about using her firearm against John under the guise of self-defense. It suggested a premeditated mindset, where she believed that simply claiming she was in fear for her life would grant her legal immunity to commit an act of violence. Investigators then turned their attention to Marique's online presence. John's niece directed detectives to Marique's profiles on a popular video sharing application. What they found was deeply unsettling. Alongside ordinary, everyday videos were several posts containing dark and threatening themes. One video featured a snarling animal with a warning not to push her to do things people would never expect. Most shockingly, another video began with an image of a headstone. Through further research, detectives discovered that Marique had been previously married to a much younger man named Dustin James Ruth. In her videos, she openly discussed his death, claiming that her husband had shot himself directly in front of her during an argument. The revelation of a second deceased partner sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detectives immediately contacted the sheriff's department in Chickasaw County, Iowa, to retrieve the records of Dustin's passing, which had occurred on October 4, 2020. Dustin was born on August 23, 1997, and was known by his family as a kind, gentle soul who struggled with severe depression and bipolar disorder. At the age of 19, he met the 37-year-old Marique, and they married in December of 2018. Dustin's family recalled that Marique maintained an intense level of control over his life, constantly accusing him of infidelity and threatening him with physical harm. When Dustin died from a gunshot wound in their bedroom, Marique claimed it was a self-inflicted act. Due to a lack of physical evidence to prove otherwise at the time, the local sheriff's department had officially ruled the death a suicide, and Marique was never charged. For the detectives in Altoona, the similarities between the two cases were too prominent to ignore. Both Dustin and John were younger men who struggled with mental health or substance issues. Both had been involved in highly controlling relationships with Marique. Both died from gunshot wounds in her presence during domestic disputes. And in both instances, Marique claimed she was a passive witness or an innocent defender. This realization shifted the entire dynamic of the investigation, reinforcing the belief that Marique was a highly calculated and dangerous individual. Armed with this new context, detectives scrutinized the forensic findings from John's autopsy. The results further dismantled Marique's self-defense narrative. John had been shot 4 times. 2 of the bullets had penetrated his wrist and arm, leaving wounds that forensic pathologists identified as defensive. These injuries strongly suggested that John had raised his hands in front of his face and chest in a desperate attempt to shield himself from the oncoming gunfire, rather than advancing to strike her. The 3rd shot entered his abdomen, and the fourth struck his neck. This indicated that John was backing away, trying to protect himself, as Marique continued to fire. Furthermore, the toxicology report completely discredited Marique's claims that John was violently drunk and high on cocaine. The laboratory analysis revealed that while John had indeed been drinking, his blood alcohol level was barely above the legal limit for operating a motor vehicle, and there were absolutely no traces of cocaine or other stimulants in his system. This proved that Marique had fabricated the claims of his erratic, substance-fueled behavior to make her alleged fear seem more plausible. To secure the case, the lead detective made a surprise visit to Marique's home, requesting that she walk them through the events of the shooting on camera. Marique agreed, confident that she could maintain her story. However, during the walkthrough, the detective asked her to switch roles and act out John's movements, while the detective pretended to be her. When acting as John, Marique inadvertently demonstrated a defensive posture, swiping her hands low near her stomach, as if trying to push away an aimed firearm rather than throwing a punch. This physical demonstration in real time showed that even in her own mind, John was attempting to defend himself against a weapon that had already been drawn and aimed at him. Following the walkthrough, detectives brought Marique and her son Cole to the police station for separate, simultaneous interviews. This tactical decision paid off. When questioned about the hours leading up to the shooting, Cole broke down and revealed the truth. He admitted that there was no physical brawl or violent escalation between himself and John. In fact, Cole stated that shortly before the shooting, John had approached him in a calm manner to apologize for his behavior earlier in the evening. This testimony directly contradicted Marique's claim that she had to intervene with a firearm to protect her son from a violent altercation. When detectives confronted Marique with her son's statement, her confident demeanor crumbled. She realized that her carefully constructed narrative had collapsed. When asked why she did not simply leave the apartment or call the police if she felt uncomfortable, she made a telling and chilling admission, stating that she had two choices, her gun and her cell phone, and she chose the gun. This statement solidified the prosecution's case, proving that the shooting was not a necessary act of self-defense, but a deliberate, hostile choice. On March 15, 2023, Marique Ruth was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The legal proceedings proved to be complex. During the pretrial hearings, Marique's defense attorney successfully argued to exclude any mention of her previous husband's death, claiming it would unfairly prejudice the jury. The judge agreed, declaring the details of Dustin's passing inadmissible. Despite this setback, prosecutors remained confident in the strength of the physical evidence surrounding John's death. The first trial began on May 13, 2024. However, during the lead detective's testimony, a portion of the recorded interview was played in court where Marique briefly and accidentally mentioned her previous husband. The defense immediately objected, and the judge was forced to declare a mistrial. Undeterred, the prosecution prepared for a second trial, which commenced on October 30, 2024. This time, the state focused heavily on the motive of jealousy and anger. They presented evidence that Marique had discovered text messages between John and his ex-fiancée, Cassie, expressing that he missed her. Enraged by this perceived betrayal and terrified of losing her control over him, Marique decided that if she could not have John, no one would. After a 5-day trial, the jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. In the state of Iowa, this conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The tragic deaths of John Killen and Dustin Ruth offer profound and painful lessons for society. Volatile relationships often escalate gradually, with warning signs that are easily overlooked or dismissed. It is vital to recognize the early indicators of coercive control, extreme jealousy, and isolation. When a partner seeks to control communication, threatens violence under the guise of humor, or relies on intimidation, these are not mere relationship difficulties, but dangerous warning signs that require immediate, safe intervention. This case also highlights a disturbing modern trend where individuals believe they can use specific legal phrasing, such as claiming they were in fear for their life, to justify acts of premeditated violence. It serves as a stern warning that physical, scientific, and behavioral evidence will ultimately reveal the truth. Justice is not easily deceived by fabricated narratives. For law enforcement, this case underscores the critical importance of looking beyond the initial claims made at a crime scene. Prompt forensic mapping of physical evidence, such as the trajectory and location of shell casings, is essential. Additionally, the rapid sharing of information between different officers and departments can uncover vital context, as seen when the neighboring officer remembered the prior body camera footage. Digital forensics, including the analysis of social media profiles and communication history, must be prioritized early in an investigation to establish a clear picture of the relationships and mindsets of those involved. Today, the family of John Killen continues to heal, keeping his memory alive through the love they share. Though he faced his own struggles with dependency and mental health, he is remembered by his children and loved ones as a kind-hearted, humorous, and deeply loving man who deserved the chance to build a peaceful future. The conviction of Marique Ruth stands as a testament to the power of truth, the dedication of the investigating forces, and the ultimate triumph of justice. The complexity of human relationships often conceals silent struggles that, when left unaddressed, can lead to devastating consequences. In the quiet corners of small towns across the country, law enforcement officers and community members frequently witness the tragic culmination of toxic dynamics, where issues of control, jealousy, and untreated emotional wounds simmer beneath a calm exterior. To understand why these cases occur with such alarming frequency, one must look beyond the immediate moments of crisis and examine the deeper psychological patterns and societal pressures that shape them. Often, individuals who struggle with a profound fear of abandonment or a desperate need for control find themselves trapped in cycles of conflict. When these personal struggles intersect with a lack of healthy coping mechanisms, the results can be catastrophic. By analyzing these tragic events, society can glean vital lessons about the importance of early intervention, the need for robust mental health support, and the critical role of diligent law enforcement in seeking truth and justice. The story of John Killen is one marked by early hardship, a search for belonging, and a persistent battle with personal demons. Born in the city of Des Moines, Iowa, in the year 1981, John was the youngest of 3 boys raised by his parents, LaDonna and David Killen. His father worked as a long-haul truck driver, a profession that kept him away from the family home for extended periods. This absence placed a significant burden on the household, and John grew up in a turbulent environment where approval was difficult to obtain. His father was hard on him, and John constantly yearned for a sense of validation that seemed always out of reach. In his teenage years, The family dynamic fractured further. When John was 16 years old, his mother left for a visit to the state of Montana and chose never to return. This sudden departure left a deep, lasting scar on young John, instilling a profound fear of abandonment that would influence his relationships for the rest of his life. In the wake of his mother's departure, John tried to forge a connection with his father, choosing to leave high school before graduation to work alongside him on semi-trucks. He sought the approval of his father with a quiet desperation, hoping that shared labor would bridge the gap between them. During his teenage years, John also found solace in his relationship with his childhood friend, Angela. The two had met in junior go-hot school and spent almost every day together, eventually marrying in the year 2002. 3 years later, their son, Joe, was born. John was determined to be a better father than the one he had known, striving to be a present and supportive figure in his son's life. However, the emotional patterns of his childhood proved difficult to escape, and verbal arguments began to strain his marriage. When their son was 5 or 6 years old, the couple decided to divorce, a decision prompted by the realization that their conflict was taking a toll on their young child. The end of his marriage deeply affected John, exacerbating his depression and leading him to rely more heavily on alcohol to cope with his emotional pain. Fearing loneliness above all else, John sought companionship on a dating website shortly after his divorce was finalized. There he met Cassie, and their relationship progressed rapidly, leading to an engagement within about a year. When John learned he was going to be a father again, he viewed it as a second chance to build the happy family he had always wanted. Despite encouraging steps, including therapy and medication, John's struggle kept. Hot alcohol continued to cause friction. The mixture of prescription medication and alcohol often worsened his state of mind, leading to an unstable relationship characterized by a cycle of arguments and reconciliation. By the year 2022, John and Cassie had separated, leaving John once again facing the isolation he feared most. Within a month of his separation from Cassie, John met Marique Ruth. To his family, Marique initially appeared to be a positive influence. She seemed independent, held a stable job, owned her own apartment, and had an adult son, Cole, who was 22 years old. John's family hoped this new relationship would bring him the stability and happiness he sought. However, beneath the surface of this new beginning, familiar patterns of conflict began to emerge. The couple argued frequently, with money and John's struggle with employment and alcohol serving as constant sources of tension. 5 months after moving in together, the relationship came to a sudden and violent end in the small town of Altoona, Iowa, located 10 miles outside Des Moines. On the evening of August 10, 2022, emergency dispatchers received a call from Marique Ruth, who stated that she had shot John Killen in self-defense. Upon arriving at the residence, officers found Marique and her son, Cole, waiting outside. Inside the home, police discovered John face down on the living room floor, deceased from multiple gunshot wounds. Marique appeared shaken, telling officers that she had asked John to leave after an argument and that he had advanced toward her in a threatening manner. Fearing for her safety, she claimed she grabbed her handgun from her purse and fired in self-defense. Her son, Cole, initially provided a statement that seemed to support her account, noting that he had heard the shots from the stairway after leaving the room during the argument. As investigators began their work, they immediately noticed details at the scene that did not align with a simple claim of self-defense. The physical evidence spoke its own silent language, prompting detectives to look closer. They observed that the shell casings from the firearm were distributed in a manner that suggested movement and advancement rather than retreat. One casing was located in the kitchen area, while others were found on the opposite side of a couch that separated the living room from the kitchen. This layout indicated that the shooter may have advanced over the couch toward the victim, a detail that stood in sharp contrast to Marique's claim of backing away in fear. Recognizing these inconsistencies, the police secured the residence and obtained a search warrant to conduct a thorough forensic analysis. During her formal interview at the police department, Marique described John as highly volatile, alleging that he was frequently intoxicated and had a history of violence. She brought up a past domestic incident involving his ex-girlfriend, Cassie, claiming that John had choked her and that a court had issued a protective order. This history, Marique asserted, was foremost in her mind during their argument on the night of the shooting. She explained that after hours of verbal conflict, she had retreated to the bedroom, but returned to the living room with her handgun to protect her son after hearing what she believed to be a physical struggle. She claimed she fired a warning shot when John lunged at her, followed by 3 more shots when he continued to advance. While Marique's narrative appeared structured to meet the legal definition of self-defense, investigators remained skeptical of the physical layout of the crime scene. They sought to verify her claims by reaching out to John's loved ones, who reacted with anger and disbelief at the suggestion that John was the aggressor. His son, Joe, insisted that his father had never been physically violent, a sentiment echoed by John's ex-wife, Angela, and his former partner, Cassie. Cassie clarified that the past incident Marique referred to had been misunderstood and exaggerated, explaining that she had never felt her life was threatened by John. Furthermore, family members suggested a different motive for the conflict, revealing that Marique had recently discovered text messages from John to Cassie, which may have sparked intense jealousy and feelings of betrayal. A breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source within the law enforcement community. An officer from a neighboring department, hearing about the case, recalled a significant encounter with Marique just 2 months prior, on June 4, 2022. On that evening, police had responded to a domestic disturbance call at a convenience store parking lot. Body camera footage from that incident revealed a revealing conversation between Marique and John's niece, Haley Killen. In the recording, Marique expressed extreme frustration with John's behavior and openly discussed the idea of using her firearm against him. The responding officer had warned her at the time that making such premeditated statements would be highly damaging in the event of a future shooting, to which Marique responded defensively, questioning if she would be arrested for protecting herself. This footage provided investigators with critical insight into Marique's mindset, suggesting she had considered the legal defense of self-defense long before the fatal encounter occurred. Armed with this new perspective, detectives visited Haley Killen, who confirmed that Marique had never expressed fear of John, but had instead made several threatening remarks. Haley also revealed that Marique possessed a permit to carry a firearm and had once boasted about her ability to make a violent act appear self-inflicted. These revelations prompted investigators to look deeper into Marique's background and social media presence. On her public profiles, they discovered a series of troubling videos. Some featured aggressive imagery and warnings about what she was capable of if pushed too far. One video particularly caught their attention, showing an image of a headstone alongside references to a past marriage. Further investigation revealed that Marique had been previously married to a much younger man named Dustin Ruth, who had passed away 2 years earlier, on October 4, 2020. Dustin, who was 19 years old when he met the 37-year-old Marique, had struggled with depression and bipolar disorder. His family described a highly controlling relationship where Marique monitored his communications and frequently made threats of physical violence. Dustin died from a gunshot wound during an argument in their home, an incident that Marique claimed was a self-inflicted act. At the time, local authorities in Chickasaw County, Iowa, found insufficient evidence to dispute her account, and no charges were filed. For the detectives in Altoona, however, the striking similarities between the two situations strengthened their resolve to uncover the truth behind John's death. The autopsy and toxicology reports for John Killen provided further clarity. The medical examiner determined that John had been shot 4 times. Significantly, 2 of the bullets had entered his wrist and traveled through his arm, a pattern highly consistent with defensive wounds, suggesting John had raised his hands to protect his face and chest. The trajectory of the bullets indicated that he was likely backing away from the shooter rather than advancing. Furthermore, the toxicology report refuted Marique's claim that John was highly intoxicated and under the influence of stimulants. His blood alcohol level was barely above the legal limit for driving, and there were no traces of stimulants in his system. To gather more direct evidence, detectives requested that Marique participate in a voluntary walkthrough of the crime scene, a request she surprisingly accepted. During the walkthrough, which was recorded on camera, detectives asked her to demonstrate the positions and actions of both herself and John. When asked to act out John's movements, her gestures suggested a defensive posture rather than an aggressive attack, inadvertently supporting the theory that John was attempting to shield himself or escape down the nearby stairway. Following this reenactment, detectives conducted separate interviews with Marique and her son, Cole. During his interview, Cole was presented with the inconsistencies in the case and eventually provided a statement that contradicted his mother's account. He revealed that on the night of the shooting, there had been no physical brawl or aggressive shouting from John. Instead, John had been quietly apologizing to him for the ongoing arguments. This admission shattered the foundation of Marique's self-defense claim. When confronted with her son's statement, Marique struggled to provide an explanation, ultimately remarking to investigators that she had been faced with a choice between using her cell phone to call for help or using her gun, and she had chosen the firearm. On March 15, 2023, investigators obtained an arrest warrant for Marique Ruth, charging her with first-degree murder. The legal proceedings that followed were complex. During pretrial hearings, the defense successfully argued to exclude any mention of Dustin Ruth's death, fearing it would prejudice the jury. The trial began on May 13, 2024, but quickly ended in a mistrial when Marique accidentally mentioned her previous husband during the playback of her recorded police interview. A second trial commenced on October 30, 2024. The prosecution focused heavily on the physical forensics, the body camera footage from the June incident, and the evidence of jealousy as the primary motive. After a 5-day trial, the jury deliberated for approximately 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder, carrying a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. This tragic case offers profound lessons for families, communities, and law enforcement agencies alike. It highlights the critical importance of recognizing the warning signs of coercive control and emotional manipulation within relationships. Often, the transition from verbal conflict to physical danger is preceded by patterns of extreme jealousy, isolation, and threats that may be dismissed as mere hyperbole. For communities, fostering open discussions about healthy relationship boundaries and providing accessible mental health resources can offer vital lifelines to individuals struggling with depression, addiction, or domestic instability. For law enforcement, the case underscores the value of meticulous documentation and cross-jurisdictional communication. The preservation of body camera footage from a seemingly minor domestic call 2 months prior proved to be the pivotal piece of evidence that dismantled a carefully constructed cover story. By treating every domestic disturbance call with diligence and maintaining comprehensive digital records, officers can build a clearer picture of ongoing patterns of behavior, enabling them to respond more effectively and prevent future tragedies. Ultimately, the resolution of this case stands as a testament to the tireless efforts of the investigating forces, who looked past initial appearances to honor the truth and ensure that justice was served for John Killen and his grieving family. The complexity of human relationships often presents a delicate balance of emotional needs, vulnerabilities, and shared histories. In the quiet expanses of small towns across the country, families build their lives in the pursuit of stability and happiness. Yet, behind the closed doors of domestic life, unresolved conflicts can sometimes escalate into tragic events that challenge the peace of entire communities. One Etouche Hat incident occurred in the small town of Altoona, situated 10 miles outside Des Moines, Iowa. Known primarily for its amusement parks and recreational attractions, this tight-knit community became the focus of a profound investigation after an emergency call. On August 10, 2022, forever changed the lives of multiple families. The subsequent investigation into the death of John Killen revealed not only the immediate circumstances of a single evening, but also opened a window into the psychological dynamics of control, jealousy, and the misuse of claims of self-defense. Understanding the causes of such tragic occurrences requires a deep analysis of the social and psychological factors that contribute to the volatility of domestic relationships. In many cases, individuals enter partnerships burdened by unresolved traumas from their past. Childhood abandonment, the dissolution of prior marriages, and struggles with substance abuse often create a fragile emotional foundation. When two individuals VKEP, high emotional needs and unresolved issues come together, the potential for conflict increases. These disputes frequently center on themes of financial strain, communication breakdown, and mutual insecurity. In the modern era, the presence of social media adds a layer of complexity, as individuals may project a certain image of their lives online while experiencing intense turmoil behind the scenes. This division between public presentation and private reality can exacerbate feelings of isolation and frustration, leading to sudden and desperate actions. The investigation into the loss of John Killen highlights the critical importance of objective physical evidence and forensic science in uncovering the truth. When law enforcement officers arrive at a scene, they are often met VKEP, itehat, conflicting narratives and emotionally charged statements. The initial account provided by a survivor may appear convincing, particularly when framed around the fear of physical harm. However, investigators must rely on the precise positioning of physical elements within the environment to reconstruct the events accurately. In this case, the arrangement of spent ammunition casings proved to be a decisive clue. While the narrative presented by Marique Ruth suggested a defensive posture and a retreat from an advancing threat, the physical location of the casings on the opposite side of the living room furniture indicated a different movement. Forensic analysis demonstrates that physical evidence does not change its story to suit a personal narrative. Rather, it remains an objective record of spatial relationships and physical actions. The contrast between the claims of the suspect and the physical reality of the scene underscores the limitations of what some individuals perceive as a sophisticated defense strategy. There exists a misconception among some wrongdoers that uttering specific phrases regarding personal safety and fear can serve as a legal shield against the consequences of violent actions. This belief represents a profound misunderstanding of the justice system, which demands that any claim of self-defense be supported by the totality of the circumstances and the physical evidence. The detailed examination of bullet trajectories and the biological evidence obtained through autopsy reports often dismantle these manufactured narratives. For instance, the presence of defensive wounds on the upper limbs of a victim strongly suggests an attempt to shield oneself rather than an act of aggression. Furthermore, modern forensic toxicology provides an objective measure of a person's state of sobriety, easily disproving assertions of extreme intoxication or substance use that are intended to portray the victim as dangerously erratic. To prevent such tragedies, communities and individuals must draw profound life lessons from these events. It is essential to recognize the early warning signs of toxic relationship dynamics, which often include extreme possessiveness, attempts to isolate a partner from their support network, and verbal threats of harm. Establishing healthy boundaries and seeking professional guidance when a relationship becomes consistently volatile are critical steps toward ensuring personal safety. Society must also foster an environment where individuals feel safe, seeking assistance to exit unhealthy partnerships before conflicts escalate to physical confrontations. Education on nonviolent conflict resolution, anger management, and the responsible ownership of personal safety tools can play a vital role in reducing the incidence of domestic tragedies. For law enforcement agencies, the experience gathered from this and similar cases provides valuable insights into how investigations can be conducted with greater speed and accuracy. One of the most effective strategies involves the thorough collection and preservation of digital footprints, including social media profiles and communications. These platforms often contain valuable indicators of a person's state of mind and prior statements of intent. Additionally, the rapid sharing of information across different jurisdictions and departments can reveal crucial patterns of behavior. A prior encounter recorded on a body-worn camera in a neighboring community can completely transform the trajectory of an active investigation by providing context that contradicts a suspect's current claims. Conducting on-site physical walkthroughs where suspects are asked to demonstrate their actions can also assist investigators in identifying logical inconsistencies in real time. To understand the full scope of this case, one must examine the lives of the individuals involved. John Killen was born in Des Moines, Iowa, in the year 1981, as the youngest of 3 brothers. Raised in a household where his father worked as a long-distance truck driver, John experienced a childhood marked by high expectations and a lack of emotional support. His mother, seeking a different life, departed for Montana when John was 16 years of age, a move that left him without maternal guidance during his formative years. In her absence, John attempted to build a stronger connection with his father, choosing to work on large transport vehicles rather than completing his high school education. This desire for parental approval shaped much of his early life and contributed to a deep-seated fear of being abandoned. During his teenage years, John began a relationship with a childhood acquaintance named Angela, whom he married in the year 2002. 3 years later, their son, Joe, was born. John dedicated himself to being a supportive and attentive father, striving to provide his son with the guidance and warmth he had lacked during his own youth. However, the emotional patterns of his past proved difficult to overcome, and after several years, the marriage ended in divorce. The separation had a profound impact on John, leading to periods of depression and an increased reliance on alcohol as a coping mechanism. Fearing solitude, John soon entered another relationship with a partner named Cassie, with whom he became engaged and fathered a daughter. Despite their shared moments, the relationship was characterized by frequent arguments, often exacerbated by the combination of prescribed medication and alcohol. By the year 2022, John and Cassie had separated, leaving John once again seeking companionship. Shortly after his separation from Cassie, John met Marique or Ruth through a dating platform. Marique appeared to be an independent and calm individual who maintained her Ove-kept-no residence and employed her adult son, Cole. John was optimistic about this new chapter in his life, and within a short period, he moved into the residence in Altoona. However, the apparent stability of the partnership quickly deteriorated, and within 5 months, the household became a center of domestic tension. The arguments between John and Marique frequently centered on financial difficulties, as John struggled to maintain employment and address his challenges with alcohol. On the evening of August 10, 2022, the ongoing disputes culminated in a final confrontation. According to the initial statements provided to the police, John had returned to the residence after transporting his young daughter to her mother's home. Marique claimed that the argument escalated and that she retreated to her bedroom to avoid the conflict. She further asserted that she overheard a loud altercation between John and her adult son, Cole, which prompted her to retrieve her handgun from her bedside table to intimidate John and defuse the situation. According to her narrative, Cole then left the room to go downstairs, at which point John allegedly advanced toward her over the back of the living room sofa. Marique claimed she fired an initial warning shot, followed by 3 additional shots when John continued to move toward her, resulting in his immediate demise. Upon arriving at the scene, officers from the Altoona Police Department found Marique and her son waiting outside the residence. Inside, they discovered the body of John Killen face down on the living room floor, showing multiple wounds to his neck, arm, and torso. While Marique appeared visibly shaken and cooperative, the physical details of the environment immediately raised questions for the responding detectives. Specifically, the distribution of the spent shell casings did not align with Marique's description of her defensive position. One casing was located in the kitchen area, while the remaining casings were found on the opposite side of the sofa in the living room. This pattern indicated that the shooter had advanced toward the victim rather than retreating, suggesting a deliberate pursuit rather than defensive action. As investigators waited for a search warrant to thoroughly analyze the residence, they began interviewing individuals associated with the couple. John's son Joe expressed strong doubts regarding the claim of self-defense, describing his father as a non-violent individual who had never used physical force during arguments. The detectives also contacted Cassie, John's former partner, who clarified that a previous incident mentioned by Marique, involving allegations of physical restraint, had been misunderstood, and that she had never feared for her life during her relationship with John. Cassie also revealed that John had recently sent messages expressing a desire to end his relationship with Marique, suggesting that jealousy may have played a significant role in the conflict. A major breakthrough in the investigation occurred when a police officer from a neighboring department recalled a prior encounter with Marique on June 4, 2022. On that evening, Marique had called emergency services from a local convenience store parking lot to report a domestic dispute, requesting that John be removed from their shared residence due to intoxication. During that encounter, which was recorded on a body-worn camera, Marique had made explicit statements regarding her willingness to use her firearm against John. The officer on the scene had warned her that making étuisé, hot premeditated remarks could be used against her in a court of law, to which Marique responded with indignation, claiming she was being threatened with arrest for merely expressing her right to self-defense. This recording provided critical evidence of Marique's prior state of mind and challenged her claim of sudden, unprovoked fear on the night of the shooting. Further investigation into Marique's background and social media presence revealed additional disturbing patterns. Relatives of the victim directed detectives to Marique's public internet profiles, which featured content that stood in stark contrast to her calm demeanor. Some videos included threatening messages, while one specific post featured an image of a headstone and discussions regarding the death of her previous husband, Dustin Ruth. Investigators discovered that Dustin, who was significantly younger than Marique, had died from a gunshot wound in October of the year 2020 under circumstances that were initially ruled a suicide. Although no charges had been filed in that case, the striking similarities between the two incidents intensified the focus on Marique's history of controlling behavior in her relationships. To resolve the inconsistencies in Marique's narrative, detectives conducted a voluntary physical reconstruction of the event at the residence. During this walkthrough, Marique was asked to demonstrate the movements of both herself and the victim. Her physical demonstrations of John's actions suggested defensive gestures, such as reaching out to block or redirect a weapon rather than an aggressive assault. This observation, combined with the autopsy findings, which showed defensive wounds on John's arm, and a toxicology report indicating that his alcohol level was minimal and free of illegal stimulants, further undermined the claim of self-defense. The final piece of evidence emerged during separate follow-up interviews with Marique and her son, Cole. When questioned about the events leading up to the shooting, Cole admitted that there had been no physical fight or loud confrontation between himself and John. Rather, John had been calmly attempting to apologize for the domestic tension. Faced with this contradiction, Marique was unable to provide a logical explanation for her actions. She eventually acknowledged to investigators that she had been presented with a choice between utilizing her mobile phone to contact emergency services or retrieving her firearm, and that she had chosen to use the weapon. Based on the comprehensive collection of physical evidence, witness statements, and historical context, the county attorney's office approved charges of murder in the first degree. Marique Ruth was arrested on March 15, 2023. Her initial trial in May of the year 2024 resulted in a mistrial due to an inadvertent mention of her deceased former husband, which had been ruled inadmissible to prevent prejudice. However, a second trial commenced in October of the same year. The prosecution presented a compelling case centered on the theme of anger, jealousy, and the deliberate decision to end a partner's life when control could no longer be maintained. After a 5-day trial, the jury deliberated for approximately 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. The resolution of this case brought a sense of justice to the family of John Killen, who remember him for his warmth, humor, and devotion to his children, despite the personal challenges he faced. The tragedy serves as a solemn reminder of the devastating consequences of domestic volatility and the critical role of scientific investigation in upholding the truth. By honoring the efforts of law enforcement and focusing on the lessons of empathy, communication, and early intervention, communities can work together to foster safer environments and prevent future loss of life. In the study of human behavior, the complex dynamics of control and possessiveness often lie at the center of domestic tragedies. Relationships that begin with the promise of mutual affection can sometimes deteriorate in toxic systems of dominance, where one partner seeks to exercise total authority over the other. The psychological motivations driving such behavior are frequently rooted in deep-seated insecurities, a desire for unchecked power, and an inability to tolerate independence in a partner. Individuals who exhibit these controlling tendencies often seek out companions who possess specific vulnerabilities, such as a history of childhood instability, a fear of abandonment, or a profound desire to build a stable family. By targeting these vulnerabilities, a controlling partner can slowly isolate the victim from their supportive networks, creating a cycle of emotional and physical dependency that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. This type of relational violence occurs with troubling frequency across modern communities, often shielded by the private nature of the home. Many cases escalate because the signs of non-physical control are ignored or misunderstood by those outside the immediate household. Controlling behaviors, such as demanding constant financial accountability, monitoring communications, and making veiled threats, are sometimes dismissed as mere relationship conflicts rather than precursors to severe harm. Furthermore, some perpetrators possess a highly manipulative understanding of the legal system, believing they can use specific strategies to avoid accountability for their actions. These individuals may deliberately attempt to create a false paper trail of victimhood, calling emergency services during minor disputes to establish a record of fear that they intend to use later as a shield. By positioning themselves as the threatened party, they hope to exploit self-defense laws, operating under the mistaken belief that simply declaring fear for one life will allow them to escape the consequences of a calculated act. To dismantle these fabricated narratives, law enforcement officers and forensic investigators rely on a combination of physical evidence, scientific analysis, and meticulous behavioral research. The physical laws of the universe cannot be manipulated by a rehearsed statement, and the physical crime scene often speaks hot absolute clarity. Among the most critical clues in any investigation involving firearms is the precise distribution and orientation of spent shell casings. When a semi-automatic handgun is discharged, The physics of the weapon dictate that the spent casing is extracted and ejected in a predictable trajectory based on the stance and movement of the shooter. By analyzing where these casings land relative to the victim and the surrounding furniture, ballistics experts can reconstruct the exact movements of the parties involved. If a suspect claims to have been retreating in fear behind a piece of furniture, but the shell casings are discovered deep in the living area, or on the opposite side of a couch, it reveals that the shooter actually advanced toward the victim. This physical reality completely contradicts the claim of self-defense, showing instead an act of deliberate confrontation. In addition to ballistic analysis, the science of toxicology plays a pivotal role in establishing the objective truth of a violent encounter. When a perpetrator attempts to justify their actions by describing the victim as highly intoxicated, aggressive, and under the influence of stimulants, a comprehensive toxicological screening of the victim provides an indisputable chemical baseline. If the laboratory results reveal that the victim had no stimulants in their system and possessed a blood alcohol concentration that was barely over the legal limit, the narrative of a wild, chemical-fueled attacker is instantly disproved. The toxicology report serves as an objective, silent witness that protects the dignity of the deceased and exposes the fabrications of the accused. Furthermore, the presence of defensive wounds, such as a bullet trajectory that strikes the wrist and travels down the arm, indicates that the victim had raised their hands in a natural gesture of self-protection, further undermining any claim that they were actively attacking the shooter. The investigation of jhene cases also highlights the sophistication of modern perpetrators, which is often characterized by a high degree of manipulation, but ultimately undermined by critical flaws. A perpetrator may believe they are executing a highly sophisticated plan by leveraging digital platforms, maintaining a carefully curated social media presence, and documenting their relationship issues to garner public sympathy. They may post cryptic messages, symbols of strength, or thinly veiled threats online to test the reactions of their peers. However, this self-perceived sophistication is almost always their undoing. True criminal sophistication is an illusion, because a calculated plan cannot account for the unpredictable nature of human memory, the diligence of modern database systems, and the conscience of close associates. The very actions a perpetrator takes to establish their defense, such as making premeditated statements to officers during prior encounters or boasting about their ability to escape justice, leave a permanent digital and recorded trail that investigators can easily piece together. From these tragic occurrences, communities can draw profound life lessons regarding the prevention of domestic violence and the importance of early intervention. It is essential for individuals to recognize that control and isolation are major indicators of future danger. A relationship should never require the surrender of one independence, financial freedom, or connection to loved ones. When a partner exhibits intense jealousy, demands access to personal accounts, or makes threats disguised as casual humor, these behaviors must be addressed immediately rather than dismissed as normal passion. Families and friends must remain active and supportive, offering a non-judgmental refuge for those who may be experiencing quiet manipulation. Encouraging open conversations about healthy relationship boundaries, and ensuring that vulnerable individuals have access to professional resources can prevent situations from escalating to a point of no return. For law enforcement agencies, the speed and efficiency of catching such perpetrators depend heavily on advanced investigatory strategies and seamless communication. Officers on the front lines must be trained to recognize the psychological warning signs of future escalation during routine domestic calls. When a citizen makes preemptive statements about using lethal force or claims that they will protect themselves by any means necessary, these statements must be documented thoroughly and shared across departments. The utilization of high-definition body camera systems provides an invaluable archive of behavioral evidence that can be reviewed months or even years later to establish patterns of premeditation. Additionally, when investigating a suspicious scene, detectives must employ the strategy of conducting separate, immediate, and empathetic interviews with all potential witnesses. By preventing individuals from coordinating their accounts, investigators can quickly identify inconsistencies and encourage witnesses to speak honestly, allowing the truth to emerge rapidly. To understand the full scope of Hadove Kep, these elements came together in a specific case. One must examine the quiet town of Altoona, which lies 10 miles outside of Des Moines, Iowa. Best known for its family theme parks and its bustling racetrack, the small community was generally a peaceful place where residents felt secure. However, on the evening of August 10, 2022, the quiet atmosphere of the town was shattered by an urgent call to the Polk County emergency telephone line. The female caller, Marique Ruth, contacted the dispatcher to report that a shooting had occurred inside her residence on 3rd Avenue Southwest. She stated that the person who had been shot was her boyfriend, 41-year-old John Killen, who had been living in the home with her and her 22-year-old son, Cole. During the brief telephone conversation, Marique Ruth informed the dispatcher that she was staying away from the injured man and was instructed to exit the home immediately to await the arrival of the police officers. When the first responding officers arrived at the suburban residence, they observed Marique Ruth and her adult son, Cole, waiting outside as instructed by the emergency dispatcher. The officers quickly secured the exterior and entered the home to check on the welfare of the resident inside. Upon entering the living room, they discovered John Killen lying face down on the floor beside a large couch that served as a divider between the living area and the kitchen. He was completely unresponsive, and it was immediately apparent that he had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. A substantial amount of blood was visible, originating from wounds near his mouth, behind his ear, and on the side of his neck. Despite the efforts of the emergency personnel to render immediate medical aid, John Killen was pronounced dead at the scene, leaving the quiet neighborhood in a state of shock. As the initial responding officers began securing the interior of the home as a crime scene, other officers focused their attention on Marique Ruth, who appeared visibly shaken by the gravity of the situation. Her hands were shaking, and she seemed highly emotional as she began to explain her version of the events to the police. She told the officers that she and John Killen had been engaged in a prolonged argument throughout the day. She claimed that after she returned home, she had asked him to leave the residence, but he had refused to do so. According to her statement, the argument escalated to a point where John Killen allegedly moved toward her in an aggressive manner, leading her to believe that he was going to physically assault her. She stated that she felt extremely scared for her safety, which prompted her to retrieve a handgun from her purse and discharge the weapon to defend herself. She maintained that she had no other choice but to use lethal force because she was in fear for her life. While Marique Ruth was providing her account to the officers, detectives began interviewing her 22-year-old son, Cole, to determine his perspective on the incident. Cole stated that he had been in the living room with his mother and John Killen while they were arguing. But he decided to leave the area because he was tired of the constant conflict. He explained that he was walking down the stairs to his basement bedroom when he suddenly heard 3 or 4 gunshots being fired behind him. Because his back was turned and he was descending the stairs, he claimed that he did not witness the actual shooting itself. This initial statement seemed to align with the sequence of events provided by his mother, suggesting that the confrontation had occurred rapidly while Cole was out of the room. To understand the factors that led to this tragic evening, investigators began to look deeply into the personal histories of both John Killen and Marique Ruth. John Killen was born in Des Moines, Iowa, in the year 1981. The youngest of 3 brothers raised by his parents, LaDonna and David. His family described his childhood as highly challenging, noting that his father was a hard-working truck driver who maintained a very strict and demanding household. John Killen adored his mother, but the turbulent atmosphere within the home eventually became too difficult for her to bear. When John Killen was 16 years old, his mother left the family home to visit relatives in Montana, a visit that ultimately became a permanent separation, as she chose never to return. In her absence, the young teenager attempted to build a closer relationship with his father, choosing to leave high school early so that he could join his father in working as a diesel mechanic on semi-trucks. He deeply desired his father's approval and worked tirelessly to earn it. As he entered his late teenage years, John Killen began dating his childhood friend, Angela, whom he had first met during their middle school years. The two were nearly inseparable, spending almost every day together, and eventually decided to marry in the year 2002. 3 years later, their son, Joe, was born, and John Killen embraced his role as a father, striving to provide his son with a warmer and more supportive upbringing than the one he had experienced himself. However, despite his best intentions, the emotional patterns from his own youth continued to affect his adult life. After several years of marriage, John Killen and Angela experienced significant marital strain, which eventually led to a divorce when their son, Joe, was approximately 5 or 6 years old. The final separation occurred after a verbal argument, during which Angela observed young Joe hiding his head in the couch cushions to block out the noise of the conflict. Realizing the negative impact on their child, Angela decided that the marriage could not continue. The dissolution of his marriage had a profound psychological impact on John Killen, worsening his existing struggles with depression and leading him to rely more heavily on alcohol as a coping mechanism. He harbored a deep-seated fear of being alone, a fear that security and law enforcement experts trace back to the feelings of abandonment he experienced during his youth. Seeking companionship, he joined an online dating platform and soon met Cassie, with whom he entered a rapid and intense relationship. Although Cassie was aware that he consumed alcohol, she did not initially realize the extent of his dependency. Within approximately 1 year, the couple became engaged, and John Killen was thrilled to learn that he was going to become a father for the second time, viewing this as a valuable opportunity to rebuild his life. Cassie encouraged him to seek professional therapy, and he began taking prescribed medications, which initially led to a period of stability and happiness. However, his ongoing struggle, cape, te, hot, alcohol frequently interfered with his treatment, creating a cyclical pattern of good moments and volatile arguments. By the early part of the year 2022, the relationship had deteriorated to the point of separation. Unable to cope with being alone, John Killen quickly sought a new relationship, and within less than a month after his separation from Cassie, he met Marique Ruth. To his family and friends, Marique Ruth initially appeared to be a positive influence. She was described as calm, collected, independent, and easy to interact with. She possessed a stable, high-paying job, maintained her own apartment, and had an adult son who was close in age to John Killen's son, Joe. John Killen was highly enthusiastic about the relationship, and his family was pleased to see him looking happy and motivated once again. However, after only 5 months of living together in the Altoona residence, this new chapter ended in the sudden violence of August 10, 2022, prompting detectives to launch a rigorous investigation to determine if the claim of self-defense was indeed accurate. Following the initial securing of the scene, detectives requested that Marique Ruth and her son, Cole, be transported to the police department to provide formal, recorded interviews, while the investigative team conducted a thorough examination of the residence. As they stepped into the living room, investigators immediately noted several details that raised significant questions about the suspect version of events. John Killen's body was positioned face down on the carpet beside the couch, which separated the living room from the kitchen area. While examining the floor and the furniture, detectives discovered several spent brass shell casings. Remarkably, one shell casing was located on the floor in the kitchen area, while the remaining casings were found on the cushions and the floor on the opposite side of the couch, deep within the living room. This physical layout of the ballistics evidence presented a major contradiction to the narrative of self-defense. If Marique Ruth had been retreating from an aggressive attacker who was attempting to lung over the top of the couch from the kitchen side, the spent shell casings would have been ejected toward the kitchen or the immediate area where she claimed to be standing. Instead, the presence of a shell casing in the kitchen and the others on the opposite side of the dividing furniture suggested that the shooter had actually advanced toward the victim, firing from a position of control. The physical evidence indicated that the individual discharging the weapon had to move over or around the couch to fire the subsequent rounds, a movement that strongly suggested aggression rather than a defensive retreat. Recognizing these critical inconsistencies, the police department secured the residence and obtained a formal search warrant to conduct a more comprehensive forensic examination of the entire property. While the search warrant was being processed, detectives at the police station proceeded with a detailed interview of Marique Ruth. She remained cooperative and relatively calm as she explained the background of her relationship with John Killen. She described their time together as highly tumultuous, claiming that they argued constantly and alleging that he was frequently under the influence of alcohol and illegal stimulants. While she admitted that John Killen had never been physically abusive toward her during their 5 months together, she asserted that she was fully aware of his past, claiming he had a history of violence. Specifically, she told detectives that John Killen had been involved in a serious domestic dispute with his previous partner, Cassie, which had resulted in a court order of protection. Marique Ruth claimed that this knowledge was fresh in her mind during their argument on the evening of the shooting, causing her to feel a heightened sense of danger. She explained that the conflict on August 10th had originated over financial matters, particularly her frustration with John Killen unemployment and his continued drinking. The argument had persisted for several hours before John Killen temporarily left the residence to return his young daughter to her mother home. Marique Ruth stated that she had hoped the brief absence would allow him to calm down, but upon his return, the tension within the home reached a critical point. She claimed that she believed he was both highly intoxicated and under the influence of cocaine. To avoid further conflict, she went into the bedroom, but she soon heard what she described as a loud verbal confrontation or a physical struggle between John Killen and her son, Cole, in the living area. Fearing for her son's safety, Marique Ruth stated that she retrieved a handgun from her bedside table and carried it into the living room, intending to use the weapon to intimidate John Killen and de-escalate the situation. She noted that Cole, weary of the arguing, decided to leave the room and head downstairs to his bedroom. Left alone with John Killen, she reportedly told him that he needed to gather his belongings and leave the home immediately. According to her statement, John Killen responded with hostility, stating that he would not leave and demanding that she leave instead. She claimed that he then stood up and attempted to move toward her over the top of the couch, prompting her to fire an initial warning shot into the floor. When he allegedly continued to move toward her, she stated that she was overwhelmed by fear and fired 3 more times to protect herself. After realizing that he had been struck, she placed the handgun on the kitchen table and immediately called 911. Although her statement was consistent with the initial account provided by her son, Cole, detectives remained deeply skeptical due to the physical layout of the crime scene. The location of the shell casings continued to point to an advancement rather than a retreat. Despite these forensic concerns, the initial review by the prosecuting attorney office concluded that there was not yet sufficient definitive evidence to disprove the claim of self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt, leading to a temporary delay in filing formal charges. This decision caused immense distress and anger among the family and loved ones of John Killen, who contacted the police department to vigorously dispute the characterization of the victim as an aggressive individual. His son, Joe Killen, spoke with investigators, expressing deep frustration and asserting that his father was not a physical fighter and had never exhibited violent behavior during disagreements. He suggested that a more likely motive for the conflict was jealousy, explaining that Marique Ruth had recently discovered text messages on John Killen's phone addressed to his former partner, Cassie, expressing that he missed her and wanted to communicate. Joe believed that his father was attempting to find a supportive way out of a toxic living situation, and that Marique Ruth had felt deeply betrayed by these messages, sparking a wave of anger rather than fear. To investigate this potential motive, detectives contacted Cassie for a formal interview. Cassie confirmed that she had received recent text messages from John Killen, which she interpreted as a desperate attempt to find comfort as his relationship with Marique Ruth began to break down. She clarified that she had no intention of resuming a romantic relationship with him, but she believed that Marique Ruth would have viewed the communication with intense jealousy. When detectives asked Cassie about the allegations of past physical violence and the protective order, Cassie explained that the situation had been greatly exaggerated. She stated that while they had experienced verbal arguments during their time together, she had never felt that her life was threatened or that John Killen was capable of severe physical harm. She clarified that the incident involving her neck, which Marique Ruth had cited, was a minor, nonviolent contact from many years prior that had been completely mischaracterized. She explained that the protective order had been filed primarily at the suggestion of local authorities to help establish necessary personal space during their separation, rather than out of fear of physical danger. The detectives also interviewed John Killen, former wife, Angela, who strongly supported Cassie's description of his character. Angela emphasized that during their many years together, including their divorce, John Killen had never resorted to physical violence or displayed an aggressive physical nature. She described him as a gentle person who preferred to avoid physical altercations, further casting doubt on the assertion that he had launched a sudden, violent attack over a couch against an armed individual. As the investigative team returned to the police department to review these conflicting accounts, a major breakthrough occurred when an officer from another municipal department overheard their discussion of the case. The officer recalled a specific incident involving Marique, Ruth, and John Killen that had occurred approximately 2 months prior to the shooting on June 4, 2022, at a local convenience store parking lot. The detective immediately retrieved the recorded body camera footage from that evening, which revealed a highly significant and telling interaction. On that night, Marique Ruth had called emergency services to report a domestic dispute, requesting that officers remove John Killen from their shared residence due to his high level of intoxication. The body camera footage showed Marique Ruth standing in the parking lot of the convenience store, speaking with the responding officers. She acknowledged that there had been no physical altercation or assault, but she insisted that John Killen must be removed. The officers explained to her that because John Killen was a legal resident whose name was listed on the lease, they did not have the legal authority to force him to leave the property simply for being intoxicated within his own home. During this interaction, John Killen's niece, Haley, arrived at the scene and offered to speak with her uncle to help calm the situation. As Marique Ruth continued to complain about the legal limitations of the officers, she began making statements about taking matters into her own hands, suggesting that she would shoot him if he returned to the residence. The responding officer, recognizing the danger of her statements, immediately intervened and warned her in a serious tone. The officer pointed out that making such premeditated statements was highly dangerous, and that if she were to carry out such an action, the recorded body camera footage would be played in a court of law and would not support a claim of self-defense. In response to this warning, Marique Ruth reacted with defensive anger, accusing the officer of threatening to arrest her for simply wanting to protect herself. To the detectives investigating the homicide, this footage was an extraordinary piece of evidence. It demonstrated that 2 months before the fatal shooting, Marique Ruth had already formulated a clear, premeditated concept of using her firearm against John Killen, operating under the assumption that she could escape legal consequences by simply claiming she acted in fear for her life. Armed with this critical context, detectives visited John Killen's niece, Haley, to obtain further details about the dynamic between the couple. Haley recalled that during the incident in June, she had tried to mediate the conflict and had warned Marique Ruth that making threats was highly inappropriate. She noted that both she and her uncle had initially dismissed Marique Ruth's comments as empty dramatic statements, never imagining that they would lead to actual violence. Haley described Marique Ruth as someone who frequently boasted about her permit to carry a concealed weapon, using it as a means of intimidation.